budget's based on a series of assumptions, and they are that the whole Australian population will be vaccinated by the end of the year, that there'll be no sustained state border closures this year and no major COVID outbreaks, and that international borders will start to operate, reasonably normally by the middle of next year. Those are very uncertain and heroic assumptions, aren't they?
We're in the middle of a pandemic, and making assumptions during normal times is difficult. To make them during the middle of a pandemic is even more so. Those assumptions are based on the best available evidence to us. We know that more than 10% of the Australian population has now received their first dose. We've seen 30% of those aged over 70 above receive a dose. We saw more than 400,000 doses rolled out over the course of the last week, more supplies coming online. So that is the assumption about vaccines. And with respect to international borders, it's quite a conservative, cautious assumption that international borders will gradually reopen from the middle of next year.
The economic recovery has come much faster than you anticipated in the budget just 6 months ago. You've had 2 quarters of the fastest economic growth on record. Employment is far rosier than expected. Given that, why the need to keep government spending so high?
Well, we're very much in the middle of a pandemic, and if you look around the world, there is a lot of uncertainty, more than 800,000 global cases a day. Europe has just gone into a double-dip recession, and here in Australia we just saw Western Australia have a statewide lockdown. So our recovery needs to be secured, and that's why this job focused primarily on supporting more jobs through investments in skills and infrastructure, the digital economy, and tax relief for families, and also to support businesses make more investments. They're the initiatives that we put in place designed to boost aggregate demand, overall economic activity, and create more jobs, because we cannot take the gains that we've made for granted.
Let's talk about the size of government spending. Last year it was 32% of GDP. For the next 4 years it will never go lower than 26% of GDP. The Coalition was absolutely screaming blue murder when Labor was at 25.9% during the global financial crisis, claiming that was waste and profligacy.
Well, Leigh, look at the context in which we're operating. A once-in-a-century pandemic and the biggest economic shock since the Great Depression. What has happened with COVID-19 has dwarfed what happened during the GFC. We saw 1.3 million Australians either lose their jobs or so their working hours reduced to zero, and that is what required us to spend an unprecedented amount of money on direct economic support programs like JobKeeper, which helped keep 3.8 million Australians in a job. So that was what was required. What you see in this budget, just to point out, what you see in this budget is that the deficits come down by 2/3 over the forward estimates, and net debt as a proportion of GDP, which is a key indicator of fiscal sustainability, comes down every year compared to what was forecast at the last budget just over 6 months ago.
You raised JobKeeper. When you're spending at this level, I assume that you would agree that there should be no waste or inefficiency. Why aren't you then chasing down firms that banked JobKeeper as a profit when they never really needed it, and taking that back to spend on things that are needed?
Well, at the time, our priority was to get the money out the door.
No one disputes that. I totally don't dispute that. I'm just wondering why you're not chasing it now.
And so the rules and the law that passed the Parliament was that businesses could access JobKeeper based on an anticipated turnover reduction of more than 30% or 50%, depending on the size of the company. That was the rules in which the companies accepted that money, and it worked. It helped stabilise the economy. So we're not going to retrospectively change the legislation. We're not going to knock on the door of every small business that happens to be profitable.
If this happened under Labor in power, you'd be outraged that they were just writing it off and that there was no accountability for that.
Whichever way you look at it, JobKeeper has been an incredibly successful program. One could argue Australia's most successful economic support program.
Of course, but that doesn't mean that it's without... just because it did do the job it was intended doesn't mean that it's flawless or that there wasn't waste built into it. And as I point out, if you're spending at these levels, surely trying to minimise waste and inefficiency has to be an utter priority.
Well, again, it worked very effectively through the tax system. You remember the debate? Labor asked us to extend JobKeeper beyond a year. We said no. It was costing at that time more than $2 billion a month, and we have seen in the month of April more than 100,000 people come off income support even as JobKeeper ended. So Labor said that they would spend more. They said that the sky would fall in if JobKeeper ended. It hasn't, and that step that we took, that decision we took, has proven to be the right one.
You want unemployment below 5%. Without open borders, how are you going to get enough workers to fill the vacancies in the sectors where they're needed?
Well, there are workforce shortages. You've identified a real issue in various aspects of the economy, the agriculture sector being one. We are working through this budget on increased programs in relation to skills and training. We have announced tonight an extra $500 million for the Job Trainer program to take it to $2 billion to support 450,000 places. The apprenticeship program has been very successful, Leigh. We've tonight invested $2.7 billion in 170,000 new apprentices, and we're also focused on getting the long-term unemployed into work by boosting the subsidies and the grants that are available to employers who take them on, as well as a focus on foundational skills like maths and English and computer literacy for those who are out of work. So there's a lot of measures that we're taking.
Even with that though, with the borders closed, you've got a problem. So let's take mental health as an example. The government's putting $2.3 billion into mental health services. But if you talk to anybody at the moment trying to get in to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist or people who work in that field, they will tell you that you just cannot get an appointment. There's no way around that because you can't just magic up psychologists and psychiatrists out of the domestic pool.
So you'll be pleased to know in this budget there's more money for actually training people to work in the mental health space.
Those degrees take like 6 years.
Including for psychiatrists and the like. This is a record spend on mental health, everything from expanding the successful Headspace centres to putting in place Head to Health new adult centres for those aged 25 and above based on the Headspace model. We also have additional support that we're rolling out when it comes to mental health to treat people who need it most.
The budget sets this out as a two-stage recovery. The first part's led by government spending and then there's a transition to private sector-led investment. But when vaccination's lagging behind world's best practice, when there's no detailed roadmap for when or how borders will open, when the state premiers close down their states for 1 or 2 cases of COVID, how can the private sector plan to invest with any kind of certainty?
Well, they are right now. Because what we've seen is investment in machinery and equipment at near highest levels in almost 7 years off the back of the government incentives that we've put in place in last budget and extended in this budget. Business conditions have reached a record high. Consumer confidence at its highest level in 11 years, and you've got more Australians in work than ever before. I know it's easy to be critical about various things, but I do want to point out that Australia right now is ahead of the global pack when it comes to our economic and our health recovery. No one's taking that for granted. No one thinks that the job is done. It's far from over in that respect. That's why this budget seeks to lock in the recovery with a whole series of new investments.
If I can ask in detail about aged care, there's $17.7 billion extra dollars in here over the next 5 years. But if we can go back to first principles, isn't the core problem here that it's a sector that's being run for profit? So there is an inbuilt incentive to deliver the bare minimum care allowable in order to maximise profit.
Well, firstly, there's a large not-for-profit aspect to the aged care sector as well. But I would challenge that assumption. I would say to you that the people even working in the for-profit aspect or sector with respect to aged care are deeply committed to their residents, are deeply committed to the highest quality care that is provided.
Look at what we've seen, Treasurer. I mean, my point, I guess, is, if you can give somebody, say, a $6 meal of chicken nuggets and frozen carrots, then what incentive is there to give them a $12 meal of roast chicken and fresh vegetables?
Well, in terms of what we're trying to do with the residential sector, what we're seeking to make it more sustainable for the longer term, and we're increasing the base funding by an extra $10 per resident per day. That's going to be welcome by the sector. We're increasing the amount of time that's required from carers and from nurses to spend with residents. We're releasing 80,000 new home care packages. They're level 3 and level 4 packages predominantly, and that's going to be of great help to people who need it. And we've got 33,000 new training places for those in the care sector, as well as a whole host of other measures to strengthen our regulatory agencies, to put in place a new act and to boost the infrastructure spending on aged care facilities. So this is a very comprehensive program of initiatives that responds to the Royal Commission, and I think it will make a real difference on the ground.
On that, say, $10 a day, how do you know, though, that, say, like the JobKeeper plan that sort of went into dividends and bottom line in some cases, how do you know that the $10 will actually filter through to residents and it won't be put in the pockets of aged care providers?
Again, we're putting in place a new regulator who will work closely with the sector. We're putting an extra hundreds of extra audits every year. There's going to be new powers for the regulators, a more coordinated system to ensure that the money being spent is getting to the residents.
One of the things you want to prioritise is innovation. You want a thriving gaming industry, medical research, biotech and so on. Yet there's basically nothing in this budget for universities, which are reeling from the loss of international students. How can the government be serious about cutting-edge innovation and research without a serious injection of money into universities?
Well, firstly, there is $19 billion a year going to our universities. We actually guaranteed that base funding from domestic students to universities through the pandemic. And tonight I said in my speech that as a result of our measures we've announced through the pandemic, there's an extra 30,000 university places. And last year's budget, which was just over 6 months ago, Leigh, I announced an extra $1 billion for research. So we're deeply committed to that sector. But what we'd also like to see is, and it's happening right now across the country, is close collaboration and coordination between our universities and our industries. Because take an area like medical technology and biotech, CSL, a great Australian company, has been driven by research done at the University of Melbourne and through our universities more broadly. And tonight we've announced a new innovation called a patent box, where patents that have been registered in Australia and derive income for a particular company can be taxed at a lower concessional rate at around 17%. And because we've developed Wi-Fi here in Australia, the bionic ear, the cervical cancer vaccine, we want to see more commercialisation here in Australia of those technologies, and putting in place a patent box that is in place in other countries like Singapore and France and the Netherlands and the UK is, I think, a step towards that goal.
The budget notes that you'll start to pay back Australia's debt when the economic recovery is secured. It makes no mention of how that will be measured, the timing of it, or any target on it whatsoever. How is this possible, debt just as far as the eye can see, when for a decade the Coalition did not stop railing about the evils of leaving future generations to pay off debt?
Well, let me remind you, when we went into this crisis, we had delivered the first balanced budget in 11 years.
But
and
no,
I
don't want to get back into the back in black thing, and I'm surprised that you raised it actually. But let me make the point. My point is, as you well know, Treasurer, that the Coalition's rhetoric on debt was that it was pure evil, and now you're arguing when it's needed that you embrace it. It's a total shift in rhetoric.
Well, you're raising a historical case, so let me raise one with you. When we went into the budget, to the pandemic, we had successfully balanced the budget for the first time in 11 years by getting welfare dependency down to its lowest level in 30 years. Now, COVID hit. Even after the drought and even after the bushfires, we were still on track for the surplus, but then COVID hit. And as I said earlier, this has been the most significant economic shock since the Great Depression.
So
and at times of national
warranted.
crises, there are no ideological constraints, and we spent as required. And as we grow the economy, as we've seen in tonight's budget, we get a dividend from more people being in work, so higher income tax receipts and lower welfare payments. That is going to help ensure that our debt to GDP, which is a key measure of our fiscal sustainability, reduces over time.
Treasurer, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Hi, I'm Leigh Sales. Thanks for watching this story. If you'd like to watch more of 730's stories, they are on the left of your screen. And tap on the button below to subscribe and get the latest from ABC News.